What if the love of your life stood in front of you with open arms, promising happiness, but someone else dangled a contract worth millions in the other hand? Would you reach for the money thinking it could secure every dream you've ever had? Or would you choose the messy, unpredictable weight of love? Imagine believing that wealth would solve everything until you realized too late that what you traded was not just a relationship, but your very chance at being whole. This is the story of Daniel Mercer. To his neighbors, Daniel was the kind of man who seemed destined for success. He was handsome in an unassuming way, the sort of person who blended into the crowd when he wanted to, but carried himself with a quiet conviction that hinted at ambition burning steadily inside him. He grew up in a small coastal town, the son of 2 school teachers. His parents often said, "We don't have much to give you but principles, and those will take you farther than money ever could." Daniel believed them, at least when he was young. But somewhere between his long nights at the library preparing scholarship applications and the humbling summers spent working 2 jobs to cover what scholarships didn't, Daniel began to plant a silent resentment in his chest. The world, it seemed, rewarded those who measured success in salaries, cars, and square footage of a house. So he made himself a promise. He would build a name so powerful, doors would never again be closed to him because of money. Enter Emily Hart. She was in almost every way Daniel's opposite. Where Daniel saw life as a ladder to climb, Emily saw it as a dance to lean into. She was bright-eyed, her laughter quick and unguarded, the type of person who could turn a crowded coffee shop into a stage for storytelling without even realizing it. They met, predictably, in that coffee shop, he studying tax codes with a furrowed brow, she sketching in her notebook, occasionally lifting her head to watch the world and smile at strangers. She leaned over his table, teased him for the grim look on his face and said, "You look like you're memorizing misery." Daniel looked up, surprised, and just like that, the axis of his world tilted. Over the years that followed, Emily became his balance. When life pressed Daniel into formulas and deadlines, Emily would tug him into midnight walks on the pier, or surprise him with a picnic in forgotten city corners. She reminded him that living wasn't just about planning, it was about breathing, feeling, risking. He loved the way she talked about her dreams, opening a community art center for kids who couldn't afford lessons. To her, talent was universal, opportunity wasn't. Together, they promised to build something meaningful. But the closer Daniel drew to graduation, the louder the old resentment echoed inside. Tuition bills. His parents' modest house sinking into disrepair. Emily, radiant but precarious, piecing together jobs to cover her own expenses. He thought, love can't pay rent. Dreams don't write checks. So when Fortune Dynamics, a rising investment firm expanding aggressively, offered Daniel a position not just as an analyst, but fast-tracked for management, complete with a signing bonus larger than he'd ever held in his hands, he felt gravity pulling him. There was a catch, of course. They wanted him in New York. Immediately. The starting package glittered not only with money, but with connections, exclusive corridors of power, where the right introduction could make a man untouchable. The night he got the offer, he sat in Emily's tiny apartment, the walls covered with her sketches taped up like a chaotic gallery. She was barefoot, painting at her easel, humming under her breath. That simple peace both comforted and tormented him. He pictured them years later, Emily still chasing passion projects, him juggling bills, both weighed down by what they called love. In that moment he believed money wasn't just an opportunity, it was the only way to prevent the disappointment he feared. So he didn't tell her that night. Not about the offer. Not about his decision already hardening. He kissed her forehead, made her tea, sat beside her silently as she painted colors across canvas. But inside, the distance had begun. The breakup came 2 weeks later. She had noticed his detachment by then, asked questions he avoided, pressed hands against his shoulders when his stiffness gave him away. Finally, late one Friday evening, he told her everything with cold efficiency. The job, the move, the fact that they were heading in different directions. She stared at him, eyes wide, not with anger but disbelief, as if the person speaking wasn't the man she knew. "Daniel," she whispered, "we can do this together. I can move. I can teach art anywhere. Why would you leave what we have?" Her voice broke. And so did he, momentarily. But pride and fear stitched him back together quickly. "Because love doesn't pay the bills," he said. Words he regretted almost as soon as they left his mouth. But he let them hang there, watched the fire drain from her face, and convinced himself he was being wise. responsible. Emily didn't beg. She didn't chase. She simply went quiet, gathered the shards of her dignity and turned away. Daniel left that night with his suitcase. In Manhattan his career soared. Luxury envelopes his daily life now, soaring apartment windows overlooking glittering skylines, custom suits pressed for high society networking dinners. He became vice president before 30. People called him brilliant, ruthless, visionary. And that old resentment, the gnawing hunger not to be denied access? It dimmed. But it didn't transform into peace. Instead, it lingered like a hollow certainty that he'd proven his point but misplaced his soul. Because at night, when the skyline went dark and silence replaced applause, he thought of Emily. He thought of paint on her hands, laughter at 2 a.m., the way her eyes filled with dreams no paycheck could measure. He rarely allowed himself to linger on what she must think now of him, of them, but when he did, it tightened around his chest with unbearable pressure. 5 years later, at a charity gala hosted by art patrons, Daniel saw her again. Different yet painfully the same. She was presenting her community art center, now real and alive thanks to sheer determination and a small grant she had crowdfunded years earlier. Children's paintings lined the walls. Emily stood at the podium, wearing confidence as beautifully as the simple dress she'd chosen. The audience hung on her every word not because of polish or wealth, but because she spoke with conviction, with heart. Daniel sat at his table, applause all around him, but he couldn't lift his hands. Something collapsed inside him. He had won the world he sought but lost the only person who ever made standing on it matter. And that was when he realized, in choosing money over love, he hadn't actually gained security. He had only bought himself a haunting silence. The applause swelled through the banquet hall, yet Daniel sat frozen, his palms pressed flat against his knees as if forcing himself not to stand, not to betray the storm tearing inside him. He had trained for years to master composure, a poker face in negotiations, a calm smile at investors' tables, but seeing Emily now unraveled all his discipline. She looked vibrant, alive, and sure of herself in a way he had never witnessed before. Time hadn't dimmed her, it had sharpened her. She stepped down from the podium, weaving through clusters of donors, her cheeks warm with gratitude as people congratulated her. Daniel watched in silence, his glass of champagne untouched, the bubbles rising endlessly to the rim like opportunities he could no longer grasp. When her eyes at last skimmed the room and landed on him, he braced himself. There was a flicker, a blink of recognition, but no extended pause. No hesitation. Just a brief acknowledgement followed by polite indifference. Emily moved on. That indifference hit harder than fury ever could. Anger would have meant she still cared enough to bleed. Indifference meant he was gone from her world, swept into the past like dust wiped from a mirror. Daniel excused himself early that night, the excuses tumbling from his lips so easily. You know how early the East Coast meetings begin? I have to prepare for a client breakfast. No one questioned him. No one noticed the tightness in his jaw. Back at his apartment, he loosened his tie, poured whiskey into a crystal glass, and stood at the towering windows overlooking the city. Lights blinked across the skyline, a constellation of ambition. Yet for all its glow, it could not warm the hollows inside him. The following weeks were brutal. Every spare moment found its way back to thoughts of her. Not just the Emily on that stage, confident and adored, but the Emily he remembered, barefoot in paint-splattered jeans, hair tied up messily, laughing at his inability to pronounce the names of her favorite French painters. He remembered her tracing shapes in the condensation of coffee shop windows, imagining murals where blank walls stood. He remembered her habit of humming songs under her breath when she focused, notes spilling unconsciously into air. And every memory was tinted with regret. For the first time in years, Daniel noticed cracks in his carefully polished world. Conversations with colleagues felt shallow. Dinner parties where wine flowed and money boasted about money seemed suddenly unbearable. Even the expensive art hanging on his walls mocked him, aesthetic investments chosen by a decorator, pieces that carried no meaning, no memory, no story. He'd bought status, not soul. Meanwhile, Emily's name began appearing in places he couldn't ignore. A feature in a local arts magazine. An interview on a nonprofit podcast. Eventually, a television segment highlighting the community impact of her center. Children holding up watercolor landscapes, teenagers discovering sculpture as a voice for their frustrations, parents following with gratitude in their eyes. Each spotlight was accompanied by photographs, each photograph by Emily's steady gaze, exuding purpose. She wasn't chasing visibility. She was radiating authenticity, and the world responded. Daniel tried God. He tried to smother the spiral in productivity. He threw himself deeper into the firm, taking projects that consumed both his nights and weekends. The strategy was simple. If he filled every waking hour with mergers, clients, expansions, maybe he wouldn't have time to feel. But humans are not machines, and somewhere along the way his mask began to slip. A board member noticed his distraction. His assistant hinted at his irritability. And though profits remained solid, Daniel couldn't ignore the unnerving awareness that the empire he had built contained no anchor. One late night at the office, pacing across spotless marble floors, he stopped at the window once again. The city glared up at him, daring him to admit his emptiness. Emily was only a subway ride away, though it felt like a lifetime. He considered calling her, imagined dialing her number just to hear her voice. But what would he say? Sorry I left you with nothing but broken promises? Sorry I valued a paycheck more than the spirit of what you gave me? He leaned against the glass and muttered, She doesn't owe you forgiveness. He was right. But the knowledge didn't soothe him. Across town, Emily's life carried its own burdens. Running a community project was no fairy tale. Leaky plumbing, limited grants, and the constant search for sponsors kept her awake many nights. Yet when she looked into the faces of children who found confidence through expression, she knew every struggle was worth it. For Emily, struggle didn't merely drain, it nourished her purpose. And that was the starkest difference between them. Daniel ran from hardship. Emily transformed it. Months passed. Their orbits brushed against each other, only occasionally shared attendance at charity luncheons, overlapping networks of benefactors. Each encounter carved deeper comparisons into Daniel's heart. How easily Emily laughed among strangers, how genuinely she listened when people spoke, how quietly radiant she became when a nervous child handed her a painted canvas as though it were a masterpiece. And every time she glanced his way, it was with the same polite acknowledgement, never hostility, never warmth. How does one compete with polite neutrality when what you crave is fire? Finally, the dam broke on a rain-soaked evening in November. Daniel sat in his luxury apartment with untouched takeout and a stack of reports he couldn't focus on. The silence screamed. At last he surrendered to the urge he had fought for months. He walked out into the rain, hailed a cab, and gave the driver the address he had memorized from a newspaper feature: Emily's Art Center. The cab pulled up to an old brick building, light spilling through the tall windows despite the late hour. He stood on the sidewalk, dripping from the storm, staring at the mural children had painted along the exterior, their small hands leaving colorful imprints across plaster like a tapestry of resilience. For the first time in years he felt nervous, truly nervous. Not about deals, not about money, but about being seen by her. Inside, Emily was sweeping the studio floor. There were crayons scattered beneath tables, easels lined like sentinels, drying canvases propped against walls. She wore that same careless style he remembered, an oversized sweater, hair knotted loosely, old sneakers flecked with paint. She looked up at the creak of the door. Their eyes met. Her broom stilled. For a moment neither spoke. The ticking of a wall clock filled the silence. Rain slid down the windows like streaks of memory. Daniel wanted to say 1,000 things but found his throat closed, words evaporating under the weight of her stare. She broke the silence first. You're drenched, she said simply, voice even. I needed to see you, he stammered, ashamed at how weak it sounded. Emily set the broom aside. She leaned lightly against a paint-smeared table, waiting. No anger, no smile, just waiting. And perhaps that was worse than anything else because it meant he was the one carrying the burden of the past, while she had already moved forward. Daniel's breath condensed in the air of the studio, his soaked jacket clinging heavily to his frame. Emily didn't rush to fill the silence. She simply let it sit, as though the room itself needed time to decide whether his presence belonged. At last he stepped further inside, closing the door with a soft click. His eyes swept the space, nervously half-finished collages pinned along the wall, clay figurines scattered on shelves, entire universes of imagination birthed by the hands of children. This was a living place, pulsing with creativity and warmth. His polished world of financial charts and quarterly reports suddenly felt sterile by comparison. I shouldn't have come without calling, he admitted, his voice ragged beneath the steady rainfall outside. But I didn't know how else to, he faltered, searching. How else to face you? Emily crossed her arms loosely. Her expression was calm, but it wasn't indifference, it was the careful, measured composure of someone long practiced at protecting herself. It's been 5 years, Daniel. What exactly are you hoping to face? Her words landed sharp. Daniel swallowed hard. The mistake, he said bluntly. The choice I made. Maybe the worst choice of my life. Her gaze didn't waver. You mean choosing money over me? He flinched but nodded. Yes. Emily tilted her head as if studying him. Strange how neatly you put it now. Back then it wasn't framed as a choice, you made it sound like inevitability. Like love was some luxury you couldn't afford. Daniel felt the shame tighten in his chest. I told myself I was being practical. That security would protect us. That maybe if I could build enough wealth I could create a safe place for her. She cut him off. For who? Because it wasn't for me. You never asked what I needed. You assumed love couldn't endure the pressure of bills, but you didn't give us the chance to even try. You decided for both of us. The rain outside intensified, streaking down the wide studio windows like mirrored tears. Daniel dragged a hand through his wet hair. You're right, he admitted. I was terrified. Terrified that we'd end up crushed under the weight of reality, that I'd lose you anyway when things got hard. So I made the coward's choice. I left before hardship could test us. Emily studied him for a long moment. Her face softened slightly, but not in mercy, more in recognition of a truth she'd known long ago. Daniel, hardship did test me. But I didn't run. This place is proof. He looked around, finally letting the truth sink into him. Every brushstroke, every fingerprint, every messy, vibrant piece of the studio's chaos was a monument to her resilience. She hadn't crumbled without him. She had built something far larger than either of them. His voice cracked, surprising him. I miss you, Emily. Every single day. I thought success would silence the part of me that missed you, but it never did. No contract, no penthouse view, no bonus check. None of it comes close to the sound of your laugh. She took a slow breath. And what do you want me to do with that? Do you want me to unlive the last 5 years, Daniel? Do you want me to pretend this place didn't rise from the ashes after you left? You want me to believe I can just step back into what we had? Her bluntness cut through his plea like a scalpel. For the first time in his life, Daniel didn't have a counterargument, no strategy, no clever framing. He felt stripped bare. I don't know what I want, he whispered. I only know I made a mistake. And I came here tonight because doing nothing, living in silence, was killing me. The words seemed to ease something into the space, if only slightly. Emily unfolded her arms, turning toward one of the canvases drying on an easel. It was a messy landscape, sun flaring against crooked trees, clearly painted by a child with more enthusiasm than technique. She touched its edge lightly. Do you know what I tell the kids here when they panic because they made a brushstroke in the wrong place? She asked. Daniel shook his head, watching her. I tell them a mistake isn't the end of the painting, she said. It's just one more mark. They have to decide if they'll let it ruin the whole thing or if they'll use it to create something new. She turned back to him then, her eyes steady, her expression unreadable. The problem is, Daniel, our painting wasn't just one brushstroke. You walked away. You tore the canvas in two. And I stitched my half into something else. You can't just come back and demand the whole picture restored. Daniel absorbed her words in silence. Pain wound through his chest, but within it was an odd thread of clarity. He had fantasized for years that maybe she'd welcome him back, angry but forgiving, the way love stories on screens like to resolve. But this was real life. Choices carried permanence. Opportunities expired. Yet, standing in that studio, surrounded by evidence of her unbreakable will, he felt something else: hope. Not for rekindled romance, not immediately, maybe not ever. But hope that this moment, painfully honest as it was, could mark the beginning of a different kind of truth between them. One that would not pretend away the past but acknowledge it fully. I don't expect you to forgive me tonight, he said softly. And maybe not ever. I don't want to erase what you've built. I just wanted you to know I see it. I see you. And I wish I'd been brave enough to stay when it mattered. Emily regarded him long enough for the silence to feel unbearable. Then she picked up the broom again, sliding it across the floor where paint chips scattered. Her posture was calm, almost gentle. Finally she said, "Daniel, you're not invisible to me. But you're not mine anymore either. If you want to do something meaningful, use what you've gained. Not on me on them." She gestured toward the rows of young paintings drying along the wall. "Help children who'll never even meet you. Put your years of chasing numbers into giving someone else the security you thought was worth everything." With that, she returned to her sweeping. Conversation closed. Daniel stood rooted to the spot, the storm outside echoing the storm within. Her words were not the gentleness he once basked in, nor were they rejection exactly. They were a challenge. A directive. For the first time in a long time, Daniel understood. Redemption would not come through winning her back. It would come only through becoming someone worthy of having once loved her. He nodded quietly, though she didn't look up to see it. Turning toward the door, he left as silently as he had arrived, rain washing him clean as he stepped back into the night. The rain did not let up as Daniel walked home that night. Each drop felt like tiny hammers against his skin, a cleansing, punishing rhythm. By the time he reached his apartment, he was dripping head to toe, but he didn't care. He let himself collapse onto the couch, water pooling beneath him, and stared at the ceiling in silence. Emily's words echoed in his mind, woven into the sounds of the storm outside. "If you want to do something meaningful, use what you've gained. Not on me on them." For years, wealth had been his shield, his sword, his proof that he wasn't small, that the world couldn't ignore him. But in one sentence, she had flipped his understanding. Money wasn't supposed to prove worth, it was supposed to create worth for others. The next morning, groggy and heavy-eyed, Daniel sat at his desk in the glass tower of Fortune Dynamics. Stacks of binders, performance charts, and contracts loomed over him. But for the first time he noticed how hollow it all felt. Quarterly profits lined in thick ink but disconnected from any real faces, any real impact. He remembered the mess of paint-splattered canvases at Emily's studio, art that breathed humanity into even its imperfections. By contrast, his tidy world seemed sterile. His assistant, Claire, knocked lightly. "The board wants projections for the Edison merger by Friday," she reminded him. He nodded absently. Of course. But in his head, another voice whispered, "And what if this is just another line on paper, while children's futures are being painted across town?" That evening he sat at his computer long after his staff had gone home. Instead of obsessing over the Edison merger, he found himself scrolling through nonprofit profiles, arts programs, shelters, literacy networks. The sheer volume of need overwhelmed him. He realized money mattered, yes, but only if directed with precision. Writing a check wouldn't be enough. He needed to involve himself. At first, the effort was awkward. Daniel attended meetings with local nonprofit coordinators and philanthropists, but his questions sounded clumsy, his presence almost suspicious. He was, after all, a man known for cutting ruthless deals, not for offering compassion. Some directors gave him polite smiles but little trust. They'd seen wealthy suits parachute in before with promises of support that evaporated as quickly as they arrived. Yet something inside him persisted. Emily's challenge rang in his ears each time doubt crept in. Use what you've gained. He had gained money, yes, but also strategy, logistics, the ability to structure deals and secure funding. Maybe those skills once turned against her dreams could be retooled to protect others. One nonprofit caught his attention, a struggling literacy foundation working with underprivileged neighborhoods. Their tiny office was stacked with secondhand books, their directors exhausted from chasing donations. Daniel listened as they admitted to him bluntly, "We don't need another speech. We need sustainability. A way to keep the doors open." For the first time, Daniel didn't default to handing out a donation check. Instead, he leaned forward, brow furrowed, the way he did in high-powered negotiations. "Then let's treat this like a business. Show me your budget, your recurring costs, your overhead. Let's restructure this like a portfolio." The director, skeptical at first, handed him their spreadsheets. It was messy grants haphazardly applied, donors forgotten, expenses bleeding into chaos. Daniel devoured the information, heart pounding. For once, here was a puzzle worth solving. One connected not to his own promotions but to actual children sitting in cramped classrooms needing books to transport them elsewhere. By sunrise, he had devised a plan. Partnerships with local bookstores. Contracts arranged with publishers for discounted print runs. A donor retention funnel modeled after client relationship strategies. When he brought his proposal back, the directors stared at him wide-eyed. "You think we can actually pull this off?" one asked. Daniel almost smiled. "I know we can. Because making sure you succeed is more satisfying than any merger I've ever completed." The foundation began to stabilize. Slowly, word spread in quiet circles that Daniel Mercer, the once cutthroat corporate star, was investing not just money, but backbone into struggling causes. Some scoffed, assuming it was reputation cleansing. Others whispered maybe, just maybe, something had changed in him. Through it all, Emily remained distant. She didn't call, didn't write, didn't show up to any gatherings where their paths might cross again. In some ways, Daniel found that both painful and liberating. His efforts weren't for her approval now. They were a mirror she'd placed in front of him, and it was up to him to meet his own gaze honestly. Yet at night, exhaustion weighing on him, he still thought of her. Not in the rose-colored nostalgia that once fueled his regrets, but in a humbler way. He saw her as the one who had pushed him to step outside himself, to face who he really was. She wasn't a finish line. She was the starting gun. Months rolled by, and his double life began to blend oddly. By day, the firm demanded ruthless focus. By night or on weekends, he poured himself into helping nonprofits recalibrate. It wasn't glamorous, it was exhausting. But when he saw children picking up books, teenagers entering art studios, families receiving support, all because his strategies gave organizations stamina he'd once reserved for corporations, it began to fill the hollow inside. The most surprising moment came when the Literacy Foundation, now stabilized, invited him to a small celebration. There were no gala dresses, no chandeliers. Just a room of teachers, kids, and volunteers. A little boy, perhaps 8, tugged at Daniel's sleeve shyly and handed him a crumpled paper drawing. It was a superhero with slicked hair and a suit jacket. Above it, in crooked handwriting, read, "Mr. Daniel helps us read." Daniel stared at the drawing until tears blurred his vision. A child who had never seen his skyscraper, his car, his apartment, had reduced him down to what mattered. A man who helped others read. That night back home, he pinned the drawing to his wall. For the first time, his apartment didn't feel sterile. For the first time, wealth wasn't haunting him, it was serving something beyond him. But progress never arrives without resistance. Inside Fortune Dynamics, whispers began. Board members noted his increasing absences, his waning obsession with purely financial outcomes. The CEO cautioned him privately, "People are starting to think your eyes aren't on the prize, Daniel. This is no time for distractions." Daniel listened, but inside he felt calm. He had spent years terrified of losing status. Now he realized status was the least of his worries. He had finally discovered a different kind of strength, the power to give. Still, one loose thread persisted: Emily. He hadn't sought her approval consciously, but whenever his mind quieted, he wondered if she knew. If maybe she had heard whispers of his efforts, of the shift in him. And if she did, would she dismiss it as guilt-driven charity, or would she see it as truth? One evening, as winter's first snow dusted the city, Daniel left the office late and found himself standing at the mural outside Emily's center again. Children's painted handprints, endless colors layered over time, stared back at him. He placed his palm against the wall, leaving no paint, but feeling the echo of hundreds who had. He whispered into the cold air, "I can't undo what I did. But I can spend the rest of my life trying to build instead of destroy." The snow kept falling week after week, blanketing the city in white silence. To most people, it was an inconvenience: slippery sidewalks, delayed commutes. To Daniel it felt symbolic. His old life had been scorched by relentless drive, but now the snow draped everything in a stillness that demanded reflection. And in that quiet, pressures built. Back at Fortune Dynamics, the boardroom temperature was heating. The Edison merger was accelerating at a brutal pace. Contracts sprawled across mahogany tables, numbers stacked like barricades. The CEO, Carmichael, was a man cut from stone, sharp, efficient, unforgiving. He had long admired Daniel's rise, had even championed him as a protege. Which was why, when rumors surfaced about Mercer's extracurricular involvement with nonprofits, Carmichael took it as a personal betrayal. At the quarterly review, Carmichael leaned his heavy hands against the conference table and fixed Daniel with a piercing stare. "I've built my reputation on young men like you, Daniel." Huskies charging forward, teeth bared, no distractions. But word is you've been chasing charity projects. He spat the word charity as if it were filth. Daniel sat straighter, measuring his words. Outside projects don't interfere with my responsibilities here. In fact, they keep me sharper. Carmichael's laugh was cold. Don't insult me. You've gone soft. Boardrooms aren't playgrounds for guilty consciences. If you want to keep climbing, prove it on Edison. Cut the fat, slash redundancy, drive margins up. Otherwise, step aside. The message was clear: profit or perish. And yet, Daniel felt the stirrings of a rebellion inside. Just months ago, he would have preened under Carmichael's praise, desperate to maintain his protégé status. Now, the idea of hollowing out hundreds of jobs just to boost a merger made his stomach churn. That night, he walked the streets in the snowfall, replaying Carmichael's ultimatum. He knew too well what would happen to real families if Edison was stripped for parts. Layoffs, severed pensions, vanished security. He thought of the boy who had handed him that crumpled drawing at the Literacy Foundation. He thought of Emily telling him, "Put your years of chasing numbers into giving someone else security." Could he really return to his old shadows after glimpsing the light? His phone buzzed, jerking him from thought. It was a number he hadn't seen in years, yet recognized at once. Susan Dre, an old faculty member from the business school where he'd once been a star pupil. Out of instinct, he answered. "Daniel Mercer," she said, her voice clipped, still bearing the authority of a mentor who had never fully coddled him. "I hear you've been involved in community initiatives. Can you spare a weekend?" She explained that the university was hosting a fundraiser gala to support local youth programs. They needed corporate heavyweights present. Could he attend? Daniel resisted at first. Gala dinners had always been his world, but now he dreaded the empty performance of clinking glasses. Still, something tugged at him. Maybe it would be useful. Maybe it would be a chance to resist Carmichael's binary worldview and find strength among others searching for meaning. 2 weeks later, he arrived at the university ballroom. Polished floors gleamed, strings filled the air, donors mingled with faculty. Daniel scanned the crowd, half bored, half nervous. And then his heart stuttered. Emily was there. She stood near the stage, speaking with a cluster of professors and students, radiant and calm. The Art Center had apparently partnered with the university's outreach program, making her a central figure in the evening. Daniel's pulse raced. Fate seemed determined to place him where he least expected. When their eyes met across the room, she didn't look away. No indifference this time, her gaze held curiosity, even guarded recognition. He swallowed hard, then forced himself to cross the room. "Emily," he murmured when he reached her. She raised an eyebrow. "Daniel. Twice in 1 year, after 5 years of nothing? What happened? Did the universe get sentimental?" Her tone was light, but the edge was unmistakable. "I was invited," he said, awkward. "I didn't know you'd be here." He paused. "You look happy." She inclined her head. "I am. Busy, exhausted, but happy. That's more than enough." Daniel wanted to dive in, to explain everything he had been working towards since that night in the studio, but the gala wasn't the place. Too many years, too many eyes. Still, the tension between them buzzed like electricity. Later, fate intervened again. During the keynote, the MC called Emily to speak about her center. Once again, Daniel listened as she told the story of children turning pain into bright canvases. Her voice still carried the same melodic conviction that had shaken him the first time. Applause erupted. And then the MC pivoted. "And now," the voice announced, "a special introduction. One of our alumni who exemplifies success in the corporate world, Daniel Mercer." Daniel froze. He hadn't known they'd spotlight him. He rose slowly as applause began. He approached the podium, Emily still standing nearby. For a moment he stared at the crowd. Wealthy donors, professors, students watching with expectation. In the corner of his vision, Emily looked on, expression unreadable, waiting to see what version of him would appear. Daniel gripped the podium. "It's true," he began, voice carrying across the ballroom. "I've built what many here would call a successful career. Fortune Dynamics gave me resources, recognition, power. But if I'm honest, for years that success came at a cost I didn't understand until recently." The audience leaned in. Some curious, some skeptical. Daniel inhaled deeply. "I once chose money over people. I believed wealth would protect me from loss. But what I gained felt hollow. Recently, through individuals braver than me, his eyes flickered to Emily, I was forced to face that truth. Success isn't measured by how high you climb alone. It's measured by how many you lift as you rise. A ripple of murmurs flowed through the hall. He pressed on. So tonight, I'm not just proud to contribute financially. I'm committing my time, my skills, my network to strengthening programs like this, to ensure opportunities don't depend on wealth or zip code. Success should be shared. The applause was tentative at first, then stronger. Some wealthy donors exchanged uncertain glances. Others nodded in approval. Daniel stepped back, his heart pounding. When he returned to his seat, Emily caught his eye briefly. For the first time in years, she gave the faintest nod. Not forgiveness. Not reconciliation. But acknowledgement that this was no longer the man who had abandoned her. After the event, as guests trickled out, Emily approached. You surprised me tonight, she said softly. Daniel met her eyes with steady calm. I surprised myself. She gave a slight smile, almost wistful. Keep surprising me, Daniel. But remember, words are easier than follow through. She turned, blending into the departing crowd. Daniel stood frozen, warmth blooming in his chest despite the cool sting of doubt. This wasn't a reunion. It wasn't redemption. But it was something. A door cracked open. Back at the office, the battle lines grew sharper. Carmichael sneered at Daniel's public speech when video clips circulated. You want to be a reformer, Mercer? Don't do it on my dime. Pick a side. Daniel realized the storm was coming. He would soon have to decide in full view of both worlds whether to protect his corporate throne or embrace the uncertain, vulnerable truth Emily had dared him to find. 2 days after the gala speech, Daniel sat in his office staring at a folder thick with contracts. The Edison merger plan lay inside a machine of numbers and clauses that seemed polished on the surface but had blades waiting to cut thousands of lives apart. A post-it note in Carmichael's blunt handwriting glared from the top. Deliver final approval by Friday. No excuses. Daniel leaned back in his chair. His reflection in the floor-to-ceiling window looked like the man he used to know. Slick suit, groomed hair, composed expression. But the eyes betrayed him. They weren't sharp anymore, they were heavy, searching. At the board meeting that afternoon, Carmichael spoke like a general rallying his army. Once we strip Edison down, profits will skyrocket. We'll offload unnecessary staff. Residual assets can be reallocated, and our stock value will soar. The other executives clapped approvingly. Daniel kept his hands folded. His mind, however, was elsewhere, imagining the staff Carmichael had just dismissed with words like unnecessary and stripped down. Secretaries with mortgages. Engineers with kids at piano recitals. Warehouse workers who lived paycheck to paycheck. When Carmichael finally paused to sip water, he looked across the table at Daniel. You've been quiet, Mercer. Your running point on this. Tell us the numbers look as beautiful to you as they do to the rest of us. Every eye shifted. For a moment, Daniel said nothing. His throat tightened. Then he forced out a non-committal, the numbers are efficient. Carmichael grinned. That's what I like to hear. But Daniel's words felt like poison. He left the boardroom with a hollow chest, carrying the folder under his arm like a guilty secret. By evening he couldn't breathe inside his penthouse. He threw on a coat and walked the streets, snowflakes stinging his face. Unbidden, his feet led him to the mural outside Emily's art center. Children's painted handprints glowed under lamplight, 1,000 messy arcs telling stories of hope. He whispered, "What am I doing?" The next day he tried to focus. He buried himself in Edison projections. Slashed departments here, trimmed budgets there. But every stroke of his pen felt like betrayal, a betrayal not only of Emily's challenge but of the small boy with the superhero drawing, of the literacy center, of himself. That night his phone buzzed. It was Claire, his assistant. Hesitant, she entered his office when he invited her in. "Daniel, may I be honest?" He nodded, weary. "The staff has noticed. You're different. Less energized about deals. People are starting to wonder if you're losing your edge." Her voice softened. "I don't think you're losing it. I think you're finding something else. But be careful. Carmichael doesn't tolerate alternatives." Daniel met her gaze and saw a flicker of loyalty there. Without thinking, he admitted, "I'm tired of tearing things down. I want to build something that matters." Claire smiled, faintly hopeful but sad. Then brace yourself. Carmichael's already sharpening his knives. The next morning, Carmichael summoned him. I want you to personally oversee Edison's transition. Announce the job cuts. Deliver the message clearly. It's Mercer's stamp of approval. Daniel froze. Executing the plan in silence was one thing. Delivering the cuts publicly, attaching his own name to corporate bloodletting, was another. Carmichael leaned closer, voice a growl. This is your loyalty test. If you want the succession plan I've promised, if you want the corner office when I retire, you'll do as told. Otherwise, Mercer, you can walk. He returned to his apartment that night carrying the folder, heavy as stone. For hours he sat at his dining table, flipping the pages. Every line item screamed at him. He thought about his parents, teachers who valued integrity above appearances. He thought about Emily sweeping her paint-scattered floor, telling him, mistakes aren't the end of the painting. He thought of Carmichael, cold, ruthless, the mirror of who Daniel once aspired to be. As dawn approached, Daniel realized, no compromise would fix this. Either he complied and reaped rewards, or he resisted and lost everything he had built. The next day he walked into the office with a strange calmness. Staff nodded nervously as he passed, sensing tension. Inside his office he drafted 2 letters. One approving Edison's dismantling, the other outlining why he would oppose it. He stared at them both for hours, each sentence pulling in opposite directions. By afternoon, Carmichael beckoned him into the executive conference room. The press was waiting outside, journalists ready for sound bites. Carmichael gestured at the folder. It's time. Daniel walked slowly to the head of the table, folder in hand. Lights from cameras flickered outside the glass walls. All eyes pressed on him. He inhaled. Steady. And finally he spoke. No. Carmichael's eyes hardened to steel. No what? Daniel laid the folder flat on the table. No, I won't announce this. I won't attach my name to a merger that guts livelihoods, that reduces people to numbers on a page. Murmurs erupted. Shock rippled across the executives like a tremor. Carmichael leaned forward, venom in his tone. You're throwing away everything, Mercer? The corner office. The partnerships. The future of Fortune Dynamics. Daniel met his gaze evenly. No, Carmichael. I'm refusing to throw away the last shard of my humanity. Silence. Heavy, suffocating. Then without another word, Daniel slid his resignation letter across the table. Carmichael's lip curled. You'll regret this. Maybe. But as Daniel walked out of the boardroom, cameras flashing around him, he felt lighter than he had in years. Like chains falling. The decision was terrifying, yes, but freeing too. He had chosen not money. Not security. Not status. He had chosen to become something worthy of all the lessons he once ignored. That evening he went not to his apartment but directly to the literacy center. The children were mid-lesson, sounding out words, their tiny voices a chorus of new beginnings. The director looked up in surprise when Daniel entered. What brings you here? Daniel smiled for the first time all day. I just walked away from my job. But I think I've finally walked toward the right thing. For the first time he wasn't terrified of what he'd lost. He was curious about what could begin. The morning after his resignation, headlines screamed his name. Fortune Dynamics exec walks out in protest. Articles dissected his decision with surgical precision. Some painted him as a crusader, a renegade bold enough to publicly defy Carmichael. Others dismissed him as reckless, a man sabotaging his career for sentimental theatrics. A few labeled him dangerous for shareholders, for the industry, for the merciless flow of profit. Daniel scrolled through the coverage, coffee cooling untouched beside him. Once he would have panicked at losing control of the narrative. Public perception had been his oxygen. But this time? Strangely he felt calm. The truth wasn't in the headlines. It was in the children reading newly printed books, in the art centers buzzing with laughter. That was where he wanted his name to live. Still fear crept in. Walking away from Fortune Dynamics meant more than losing a title. It meant severing access to resources, to influence, to comfort. The penthouse still stood, but for how long? Severance would vanish quickly if he didn't step carefully. He had chosen purpose over money, but purpose didn't exactly write mortgage checks. He spent days poring over his finances, sketching possible futures on yellow notepads. For the first time since his 20s, he was budgeting like an anxious student, except this time the stakes were higher. Yet buried within the stress was a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: humility. It grounded him, stripped him of illusions. But the world did not sit quietly. Carmichael, furious at the public embarrassment, went on a smear campaign. Anonymous sources leaked stories about Daniel's unreliability and fragile mental state. Some former colleagues stopped returning calls. Potential consulting offers evaporated. Carmichael was making sure doors slammed shut. One evening, news crews camped outside his building. "Mr. Mercer," they shouted, "do you regret leaving the merger? Was it personal? Is it true you're broke?" Daniel kept his voice even as he slipped past. No comment. And though the questions cut, he held his chin steady. He had chosen this. Let the world mock, he knew what mattered. Inside the storm of gossip, something unexpected happened. The nonprofits he had helped began to rally around him. Leaders quietly reached out, thanking him for standing publicly for what they desperately wished powerful men would say. "You have allies," one woman told him softly over the phone. "We can't give you a salary, but we can give you purpose. Purpose, not profit." He clung to that phrase. Weeks passed in a blur. Daniel worked quietly with smaller organizations, advising on funding strategies, restructuring programs precarious on the edge of collapse. He had less money now, fewer luxuries. Nights were lean, meals simpler. But there was a certain peace in walking humbly into cramped offices where gratitude replaced cynical handshakes. Meanwhile, Emily watched from a distance. She hadn't reached out, nor responded to the nightly whirl of corporate scandal surrounding him. But she saw his name whispered in nonprofit circles, saw the impact his strategies were securing. Against her instincts, she began to wonder, was this really the same man who left me with nothing but excuses? Their inevitable collision came sooner than either expected. The university announced a collaborative initiative, a multi-sector plan to connect underfunded arts programs with literacy networks, in hopes of creating holistic community centers. It was ambitious, risky, borderline chaotic, but it needed strong organizers. And somehow, Daniel and Emily found themselves invited to the same round table. The room was modest, filled with passionate leaders. Papers and coffee cups cluttered the table. Daniel entered a few minutes late, quiet but composed. Emily had been speaking with the group already, laying out visions for expanding student access to resources. She saw him slip into a chair across the table. Their eyes met. For once, hers didn't harden immediately. She merely studied him, measured, cautious. When the discussion turned to financial sustainability, all eyes shifted to Daniel. He cleared his throat. These initiatives fail when passion outruns structure. You can have the best mission in the world but collapse if your budget bleeds. We need contracts, retention strategies, sustainable funding streams. Otherwise, this dies in 3 years. Emily crossed her arms, but not in dismissal, more as though intrigued. "And what happens when structure suffocates passion?" she asked. "If every brushstroke is predetermined, where's the art left?" He smiled faintly, sadness laced through it. "That was my mistake before. I chose numbers over heart. I know structure without passion is hollow. But passion without structure is fragile. Maybe together they survive." The table stilled. Leaders glanced between them, sensing decades of history in a few sentences. For Emily, it wasn't flirtation, it was confrontation, but of a different kind, testing whether this Daniel had learned balance. Afterward, as the group dispersed, Emily lingered. "You handled yourself differently," she said softly. Daniel hesitated. "I meant what I said. Passion without structure fails. Structure without passion destroys. I don't want to destroy anymore." Her expression softened, perhaps against her will. "I know. I've seen the work you're doing. People talk." Hope lit quietly in his chest. He stepped closer. "Then you know this isn't guilt-driven. It's who I'm becoming." Emily tilted her head. "Be careful. Becoming isn't the same as being. I'll know the difference eventually." And with that, she walked away, leaving him again with the echo of her challenge. Authenticity, not performance. Over the next month, they worked in proximity, side by side on the joint initiative, cautious but respectful. At times their conversations were purely professional. Budgets, grants, logistics. Yet beneath the surface was an unspoken history, a current neither dared name. One evening, news crews camped outside his building. "Mr. Mercer," they shouted. "Do you regret leaving the merger? Was it personal? Is it true you're broke?" Daniel kept his voice even as he slipped past. No comment. And though the questions cut, he held his chin steady. He had chosen this. Let the world mock, he knew what mattered. Inside the storm of gossip, something unexpected happened. The nonprofits he had helped began to rally around him. Leaders quietly reached out, thanking him for standing publicly for what they desperately wished powerful men would say. "You have allies," one woman told him softly over the phone. "We can't give you a salary, but we can give you purpose. Purpose, not profit." He clung to that phrase. Weeks passed in a blur. Daniel worked quietly with smaller organizations, advising on funding strategies, restructuring programs precarious on the edge of collapse. He had less money now, fewer luxuries. Nights were lean, meals simpler. But there was a certain peace in walking humbly into cramped offices where gratitude replaced cynical handshakes. Meanwhile, Emily watched from a distance. She hadn't reached out, nor responded to the nightly whirl of corporate scandal surrounding him. But she saw his name whispered in nonprofit circles, saw the impact his strategies were securing. Against her instincts, she began to wonder, was this really the same man who left me with nothing but excuses? Their inevitable collision came sooner than either expected. The university announced a collaborative initiative, a multi-sector plan to connect underfunded arts programs with literacy networks, in hopes of creating holistic community centers. It was ambitious, risky, borderline chaotic, but it needed strong organizers. And somehow, Daniel and Emily found themselves invited to the same round table. The room was modest, filled with passionate leaders. Papers and coffee cups cluttered the table. Daniel entered a few minutes late, quiet but composed. Emily had been speaking with the group already, laying out visions for expanding student access to resources. She saw him slip into a chair across the table. Their eyes met. For once, hers didn't harden immediately. She merely studied him, measured, cautious. When the discussion turned to financial sustainability, all eyes shifted to Daniel. He cleared his throat. These initiatives fail when passion outruns structure. You can have the best mission in the world but collapse if your budget bleeds. We need contracts, retention strategies, sustainable funding streams. Otherwise, this dies in 3 years. Emily crossed her arms, but not in dismissal, more as though intrigued. "And what happens when structure suffocates passion?" she asked. "If every brushstroke is predetermined, where's the art left?" He smiled faintly, sadness laced through it. "That was my mistake before. I chose numbers over heart. I know structure without passion is hollow. But passion without structure is fragile. Maybe together they survive." The table stilled. Leaders glanced between them, sensing decades of history in a few sentences. For Emily, it wasn't flirtation, it was confrontation, but of a different kind, testing whether this Daniel had learned balance. Afterward, as the group dispersed, Emily lingered. "You handled yourself differently," she said softly. Daniel hesitated. "I meant what I said. Passion without structure fails. Structure without passion destroys. I don't want to destroy anymore." Her expression softened, perhaps against her will. "I know. I've seen the work you're doing. People talk." Hope lit quietly in his chest. He stepped closer. "Then you know this isn't guilt-driven. It's who I'm becoming." Emily tilted her head. "Be careful. Becoming isn't the same as being. I'll know the difference eventually." And with that, she walked away, leaving him again with the echo of her challenge. Authenticity, not performance. Over the next month, they worked in proximity, side by side on the joint initiative, cautious but respectful. At times their conversations were purely professional. Budgets, grants, logistics. Yet beneath the surface was an unspoken history, a current neither dared name. One evening, after a marathon planning session, the two found themselves alone in the dimly lit conference room. Papers sprawled around them like exhausted soldiers. Emily stretched, rubbing her eyes. "You never stop," she muttered, half admiring, half weary. "I used to think stopping was weakness," Daniel replied. "Now I think stopping is courage. I'm still learning." Silence hung. She regarded him for a long moment. Then, almost reluctantly, "You're different, Daniel. I don't know if it's enough, but you are different." He felt warmth sting his eyes, but he kept his voice steady. That's all I can ask, that you see the difference. The night ended without any grand resolution, no sudden embrace, no sweeping romance. But as Daniel gathered his papers and stepped into the cold air outside, he realized this. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't in the headlines or contracts, but in the slow rebuilding of trust, brick by fragile brick. And though Carmichael's shadow still loomed, though whispers of betrayal still followed him, Daniel felt something he hadn't in years: real hope. By spring the city thawed. Snowmelt trickled down gutters, trees began budding, and people shed their heavy coats for lighter jackets. But Daniel's world boiled with pressure hotter than any summer sun. Carmichael had not loosened his grip. When one empire feels threatened, it sharpens its claws, and Carmichael's claws were everywhere. First came the financial Cold War. Emails trickled into Daniel's inbox from contacts who had spoken warmly to him only months before. Apologies, circumstances have changed. We won't be able to move forward on your advisory role. Investors he had hoped would support nonprofit ventures suddenly ghosted. One banker admitted privately, Carmichael's people made it clear supporting you means losing his business. He controls too much. Sorry, Daniel. Then came the legal traps. Petty reviews of contracts he'd signed years earlier, investigations opened on technicalities, audits meant to drain his time and resources. The message was clear. Carmichael didn't just want him gone, he wanted him broken. Daniel weathered each blow quietly, though inside the weight pressed harder each day. Perhaps once he would have shrunk back or begged forgiveness. But this time, instead of curling inward, he leaned outward toward the very communities Carmichael disdained. Toward the nonprofits that welcomed his energy, toward projects that gave him hands-on purpose. The Literacy Center now flourished under the sustainability structures he'd helped put in place. The joint initiative with Emily and the university gained traction, slowly weaving together a patchwork of passion and structure. Every time he saw after-school kids sprawled across library floors or paint-smeared teens debating colors louder than politics, he reminded himself, this is why I walked away. Still, he could not deny the shadow Carmichael was casting. He lost his penthouse, downsized to a modest apartment downtown, box by box. Luxury cars went up for sale. In their place, hand-me-down furniture, second-hand ink stains from late-night notes. Oddly enough, it didn't hurt the way he'd feared years ago. The shrinking of wealth didn't feel like suffocation. It felt, somehow, like trimming dead weight from a balloon, letting him finally breathe lighter air. Emily noticed. Their paths crossed weekly on the initiative, and though she kept guard over her emotions, she couldn't help seeing the differences. Daniel arrived now without the armor of tailored suits, sometimes in rolled sleeves and scuffed shoes, sometimes with circles under his eyes from late nights spent helping nonprofits restructure. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, human. One evening after a planning session, she stopped him in the hallway. You lost something, she observed. The penthouse, the shine. I didn't think you'd ever let all that go. Daniel shrugged, almost smiling. Turns out money buys silence. But silence doesn't let you sleep. She studied him, unsure whether that was wisdom or performance. And now? Are you sleeping? Not always, he admitted. But when I can't, it's because my head is full of ideas. Not regrets. For a brief flicker, her eyes softened. Then she tucked her hair behind her ear and walked away, leaving Daniel with the faintest ember of hope. But Carmichael wasn't satisfied with economic sabotage. He wanted spectacle. The Fortune Times, an industry paper with wide circulation, ran an exposé one morning, The Fall of Daniel Mercer. It painted him as disloyal, opportunistic, even hinting he'd leveraged nonprofits as tax shelters. The article dripped with disdain, but what struck Daniel hardest was the photograph. A candid shot of him leaving the Literacy Center, smiling at a cluster of kids. To the paper, it was proof of hypocrisy. To him, it was the one thing no narrative spin could devalue. He clipped that photo and pinned it on his wall. Let the world mock him. If children's laughter was their evidence of his alleged sins, it was a judgment he'd gladly plead guilty to. Still, the attacks took their toll. Phones went unanswered. Projects stalled under financial blocks. One night, Daniel sat at his desk staring at bills, wondering how long until even the modest apartment slipped away. He pressed his forehead into his hands and whispered almost angrily, "What if I can't outrun him? What if Carmichael is too big? A quiet knock startled him. Emily stood in the doorway, unexpected, hesitant. "I heard about the article," she said softly. He tried to grin weakly. "I hope you canceled your subscription." She didn't laugh. Instead, she stepped in, closed the door, and pulled the chair opposite him. "Daniel, you need to be smart. Carmichael doesn't fight fair. Every move you make, he'll smear. Every hand you extend, he'll slap away." "I know," Daniel admitted. "But if I stop, then he wins not just over me but over everyone who might believe you can challenge the system without being crushed." Emily stared at him, torn. "I don't know if you realize how dangerous this gets. You're not just risking your bank account anymore. He could ruin you completely." He exhaled slowly. "Then maybe that's the price. Once I chose money over love and found it wasn't worth the cost. Now maybe the choice is integrity over comfort. And if it costs me everything, so be it." Her chest tightened at his words. He wasn't the Daniel she remembered, the one who had treated money as God. He wasn't even the Daniel she hated after he left. This man, ragged but unflinching, was something different altogether. Something harder to dismiss. She looked at him long, then rose slowly. At the door she paused. "Don't play martyr, Daniel. Martyrs leave ashes. Be smarter than Carmichael. Build something he can't erase." And then she was gone again. The words haunted him. Build something he can't erase. Could he? He had no empire now, no army, no boardroom. But maybe that was the point. Empires topple. Legacies built out of spreadsheets rot. But children learning to read, murals painted across broken buildings, teenagers who discover hope through colors? Those don't vanish, they ripple. That night, Daniel began sketching a plan. Not for a single center, not for a single grant. For a network. A coalition uniting literacy and arts and mentorship, the very passion and structure balance he had come to believe in. Something too vast for Carmichael to suffocate, too human to be erased by ink and headlines. And somewhere in his chest, as dawn broke across the sky, he felt it. Fear, yes, but entwined with exhilaration. He wasn't running anymore. For the first time in years, he was truly leading. Daniel's tiny downtown apartment had become less of a living space and more of an unholy cross between a war room and a charitable startup incubator. Papers littered the kitchen counter, mugs of half-drunk coffee lined the windowsill, and sticky notes clung to every vertical surface like a second, chaotic wallpaper. But amidst the disorder, something pulsed like a living organism. A vision. He called it, with characteristic lack of poetic flair, the network. At night, he sometimes tried more inspiring titles: The Bridge, Renaissance, Canvas and Chapter, but The Network remained on his folders, perhaps because at its heart it was simple. Not one project, not one savior swooping in with a check and a speech, but a web, non-profit leaders, educators, artists, business planners, all yoked together for sustainability. Not scattered candles trying to shine against Carmichael's storm, but a string of lanterns, each fueling the other until the dark had no chance. The first problem was obvious, though: money. Ironically, without fortune dynamics, he could no longer simply pour his own wealth into initiatives. Severance checks and dwindling savings offered only so much. He needed allies with pockets and hearts deeper than his own. So Daniel started calling donors. Not the typical ones Carmichael charmed over $1,000 bottles of Bordeaux, but the smaller ones, the ones who never made the business pages because their checks weren't flashy enough to buy recognition. Bookstore owners, retired teachers, parents of kids whose lives Emily's art center had touched. These conversations lacked polish. Sometimes he stumbled, sometimes his voice cracked, but repetition sanded him down to authenticity. He found an unexpected ally in an unlikely place: Claire, his former assistant, who had quietly resigned after watching Carmichael tighten screws around the firm. "You're building something I actually want to work for," she told him bluntly. "So you don't have a choice, you're hiring me." It turned out he desperately needed her. If Emily was the artist of vision and Daniel the one who'd learned the architecture of funding structures, Claire was the one who glued everything together day to day. When Daniel became too consumed by grand strategies, Claire was the one to bark, "You can't run a coalition if you keep forgetting lunch meetings, Daniel." But the network needed more than logistics, it needed credibility. And credibility sat across town in a sunlit studio splattered with children's paint. The next time Daniel saw Emily, it wasn't at a gala or forced roundtable. It was on her turf, unannounced, but this time, he carried not apologies but blueprints. She frowned at the stack of binders he laid on her paint-smeared desk, then raised a skeptical eyebrow. What is this, another financial storm in a spreadsheet teacup? He gestured, almost sheepish. It's a framework. Not to cut, not to gut. To connect. Art centers, literacy programs, mentoring hubs. We've been treating them like fragile islands, constantly begging for survival. What if we link them, give them backbone? Sustainability. Shared funding models. Economies of scale, but for humanity instead of profit. Emily flipped through the tabs without answering for a long while. Finally she said, "And why are you telling me?" "Because," he said quietly, "if I build this without you, it's numbers on a page again. And I swore never again." Her breath caught, though she masked it well, but a long silence stretched between them, broken only by the rustle of papers. At last she rested her hand on one binder. "You want me to believe you're not just guilt-ridden? That this isn't about buying back what you lost?" "It can't be," Daniel admitted. "What I lost can't be bought. I know that now. This is about proving even to myself that I can finally stop destroying." She studied him for another long beat. Something flickered over her face, maybe not forgiveness, but less than dismissal. "We'll test it," she said at last, lifting the binder. "But be warned, I don't play nice with paper emperors anymore. If you pull a Carmichael move, I'll burn these in my kiln." Daniel almost smiled, a laugh tugging despite how tightly his chest ached. "That's fair. Honestly, it's what I deserve." And so Emily, reluctantly but unmistakably, became not a lover, not yet a friend, but something perhaps more important, a collaborator. The months that followed were the most grueling and the most exhilarating Daniel had lived since his meteoric corporate rise. Public attacks from Carmichael continued, but so did unexpected grassroots support. The network snowballed not through glossy headlines, but through whispered introductions, small victories, ripple after ripple. A tutoring program on the brink of collapse was saved by bookstore donor partnerships. An art studio previously hemorrhaging funds stabilized with literacy program crossover grants. Volunteers began sharing the network's name like it was a safety rope, something tying them all together. Daniel worked until his eyes burned. Emily worked with him, sometimes across conference tables, sometimes across studio benches, while children's laughter filtered in from the next room. Slowly, the guarded frost between them thawed, not erased, not rewritten, but thinned enough that one night, when Daniel looked up from scribbled financial projections and caught Emily watching him with an expression softer than skepticism, he felt hope stir like a cautious green shoot breaking through late spring frost. But just as the network began gaining traction, the storm broke harder. Carmichael didn't merely smear Daniel, now he tried to strangle every partner organization joining the network. Sponsorships pulled, grants mysteriously rescinded under legal revisions. A few directors panicked and fled. Others doubled down in solidarity. And Emily? She simply stood taller. "If you're building something Carmichael hates this much," she told Daniel as they left a battered meeting one night, "then maybe it means you've hit the right nerve." Daniel chuckled wearily. "Or maybe I've dragged you into a war you didn't ask for." Emily's gaze sharpened. "Daniel, I've been fighting this war long before you learned it existed. You're just finally standing on the right side of the line." For the first time in years he felt not small, not hollow, but seen. He would need that light soon, because the war Carmichael was preparing would no longer be fought in whispers or boardrooms. It was about to spill fully into the public square. That's Section 9. Daniel and Emily working together, their dynamic shifting from cold estrangement to wary collaboration, while Carmichael escalates beyond smear campaigns into all-out sabotage. Now let's close the story with Section 10, where Daniel faces Carmichael's last assault, Emily weighs the truth of his transformation, and Daniel finally embraces both love and legacy not as possessions, but as shared freedoms. The breaking point came on a Tuesday, though it felt like history had been conspiring toward it for years. That morning, Fortune Dynamics announced a lawsuit against Daniel Mercer and the network, alleging misappropriation of strategies and intellectual property. It was a move both ridiculous and effective. Daniel had taken nothing tangible from Carmichael, but in court, perception was often more lethal than truth. By afternoon, news anchors declared the network embroiled in scandal, and smaller donors began trembling. Emily stormed into Daniel's apartment, waving a printout of the lawsuit. "Do you understand what this means? He's coming for blood. For your blood and by extension the kids. Daniel rubbed his temples, exhausted. I know. And he'll win the headlines for a while. Maybe even scare some funding loose. But Carmichael can't win the story forever because here's the thing. He doesn't actually believe in the people he crushes. He doesn't think they'll fight back. He doesn't understand they are the network. Her eyes burned. And you? Do you understand what you're risking? If you lose, your name is Ash. Everything collapses. He met her gaze steadily. If I play it safe, the kids still lose. If I fight, maybe I lose everything, but maybe they don't. Her anger flickered, giving way to something more dangerous. Fear. And what about you, Daniel? Is this still about redemption in my eyes? For the first time, Daniel shook his head. Emily, I don't need redemption from you. Not anymore. If you never forgive me, I can still live with that. What I can't live with is teaching children by example that greed always wins. Silence thickened between them until Emily finally whispered, almost to herself, You are different. The trial became a public circus. Cameras swarmed the courthouse. Op-eds dissected every clause of corporate law. Carmichael strutted into court with armies of lawyers, smirking like a Caesar marching into a coliseum. Daniel, by contrast, walked in with 2 pro bono attorneys, a folder of transparent books, and unexpectedly Claire, who refused to abandon her post. What surprised the judge wasn't the legal wrangling. It was the outpouring. Letters poured in from parents of literacy students, from volunteers, from children themselves, written in shaky pencil scrawls and crayon colors, each declaring what the network had given them. Carmichael scoffed. This is irrelevant sentimentality, he spat. The judge leaned back, eyes sharp. Maybe you should relearn, Mr. Carmichael, that law exists to serve people, not the other way around. The courtroom murmured. For the first time, Carmichael's smirk faltered. When the judge finally dismissed the lawsuit as baseless intimidation, Daniel felt his lungs expand again, as though 5 years of suffocation had finally exhaled. Emily, sitting quietly in the gallery, watched as relief washed through him, and though her arms stayed crossed, her lips trembled into the faintest flicker of a smile. That summer, the network officially launched its first 3 unified community hubs. Literacy, art, and mentorship programs housed together. Kids sprawled across library rugs with books, then shuffled next door to splash paint onto canvases, then gathered with mentors for guidance about futures they thought unreachable. Parents wept. Volunteers celebrated. At the opening ceremony, donors asked Daniel to speak the way they always did. But this time he stepped aside. He handed the microphone to a trembling 12-year-old girl who had once been too shy to read aloud in class but now painted mural panels on weekends. Her voice cracked, but she told the crowd, "This place gave me a future." And for once, Daniel had no desire to command the spotlight. Watching her, he finally understood. His legacy wasn't his words but hers. Later, as the sun dipped pink across the city, Emily found him standing near the mural. She studied him for a long time, no easy generosity in her eyes, but something steadier. "You really did it," she said softly. "You built something Carmichael couldn't erase." Daniel swallowed. Not alone. Never alone. They stood in silence, side by side, until she turned to him. Her hand brushed hesitantly against his. Not a promise, not a rekindling, just a touch. But her voice was sure. Maybe forgiveness isn't about erasing the past. Maybe it's just deciding the past doesn't get to own the future. Daniel's breath caught. He didn't speak. He simply closed his hand gently around hers, knowing that whatever lay ahead, love, friendship, or only partnership, he was already whole. And for the first time in a decade, Daniel Mercer no longer felt haunted by the silence of wealth. He felt surrounded by voices, children laughing, communities rising, Emily's steady presence beside him. He had chosen money once and it broke him. Now, at last, he had chosen people. And in choosing them, he had found what wealth could never buy, a life that mattered.